이렇게 계엄군 출동 상황도 직접 챙긴 윤석열 대통령이
I think it's fair to say that South Korea has got the attention of the whole world right now. Hi guys, Han here, and a lot of you guys have been asking me to talk about what the hell is going on in South Korea these days from the perspective of somebody living here. But I'm happy to tell you that you haven't come to the right place just because I live here. But I also majored in Korean studies at university and have studied Korean history on 3 separate occasions. So I can provide a lot of context to this situation that I think a lot of other sources may be missing. While admittedly I didn't take a politics module while I was in university, it is a pretty integral part of Korean history. And I've also been lucky enough to have the help of 3 actual native Koreans to write the script and provide sources. So I can say that a lot of the information I will give will be fairly accurate. However, I will do my best to indicate when anything I say is speculative or conspiratorial in nature. I'll also have a bunch of sources linked down in the description for any of you who would like to double check anything that I say. Not only that, I also have an exclusive quote from one of the attendees of the protest in front of the National Assembly on the night of the martial law decree. So we'll be hearing from the real opinions of Korean people as well. Anyway, grab some popcorn as this is going to be a long one and we're going to be going over what the hell happened, how Korean people reacted, what's happening next, and why this all began. At approximately 10:23 p.m, the South Korean president Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law. As you can imagine, most people would assume this is happening because of North Korea attacking. However, he stated in his emergency address that this is because he believed the opposition party, the Democratic Party, was full of North Korean sympathizers who were trying to paralyze the government by impeaching some of his party members and blocking his budget proposal for the next year. You don't have to be the most well-versed in politics to know that this doesn't make sense. You're literally accusing members of your own government of being sympathizers with the enemy. Just to give a bit of context to the political side here, Yoon Suk-yeol is from the ruling party, the People Power Party, which we're going to refer to as PPP for the rest of this video. They are Korea's conservative alt-right party, very comparable to the conservative Republicans of America. On the other hand is the Democratic Party, otherwise known as DP, and they are the major opposition party. Korea, like most developed countries, is a 2-party system. They do have minor parties, but they are minor and honestly quite insignificant. But DP is the Democratic Party. They advertise themselves as being centre-left, but as a Westerner, just looking at their policies and things they do, I would still say they're pretty right-leaning. But for all intents and purposes, they are the left side leaning the opposition party to the president's party. Furthermore, within the National Assembly, which is essentially Korea's version of Congress or the House of Parliament in the UK, the majority of the seats, I believe 260 something seats, quick correction, it's 170 members of the National Assembly are from the Democratic Party, belong to DP, while only 108 seats belong to the PPP, and that is because the votes for the National Assembly and the votes for the president are 2 separate occasions, and unfortunately the PPP haven't been performing great like in recent history. So it just so happened that even though the president is from the PPP, most of the seats in the National Assembly are held by his opposition, which, as you can imagine, creates conflict. So yes, it's not a crazy claim to say that the DP were opposing his proposal or shutting down policies that he wanted to make, but what do you expect? You're literally in the enemy's house. Like, I don't think that's justification enough to call martial law, but President Yoon sure did. And as part of the martial law, these are the rules that the Korean public would be subjected to. Number 1, all political activities, including activities of the National Assembly, local councils, political parties, and political association rallies and demonstrations are prohibited. Number 2, all acts that deny or attempt to overthrow the free democratic system are prohibited. The insemination of fake news, manipulation of public opinion, and false propaganda are prohibited. Number 3, all media and publications are subject to the control of the martial law command. Strikes, work stoppages, and rallies that incite social chaos are prohibited. Number 4, trainee doctors and all other medical personnel who are on strike or have left their work sites must return to their positions within 48 hours and work faithfully. Those who violate the order will face punishment in accordance with the Martial Law Act. And number 5, innocent ordinary civilians, excluding anti-state forces and other subversive forces, will be subject to the measures to minimize inconvenience in their daily lives. I mean, you know, minimize the inconvenience other than literal martial law. And I think this is a good point to define martial law for those of you who aren't sure what it means. Essentially, martial law is the military taking over all the roles of the government. This is usually implemented in times of war with the president as the commander-in-chief, and he has full control over the military, and the military have full control over everything else. And this is usually done to basically skip a lot of the bureaucracy and legislation that would go into everyday functions in the times of war, so that actions can be taken quickly and effectively and prevent further casualties. However, in Korean history, martial law has usually been used for other nefarious purposes, which we will talk about shortly, but I just want to get through the timeline first. I think also something that's worth noting here as well is that technically this declaration of martial law is illegal. Reuters says in their article, South Korea's constitution says the president can declare martial law when it is considered necessary to cope with a military threat or to maintain public safety and order by mobilizing military forces. The president's martial law declaration must be reviewed by the cabinet, and when martial law is declared by the president, they must notify the National Assembly of this decision. The key point there is the must notify the National Assembly part. This is because the National Assembly are the only ones who have the authority to stop martial law should they be against it. And they can do that through a majority vote. But the president didn't actually give any notice to the National Assembly when he did this. In fact, it's speculated the reason he did this so late at night is because he would expect the National Assembly members to be in their homes, to not be near the National Assembly building, and therefore it stops them from being able to gather and do a formal vote to nullify the martial law, because they can't get in the building. Unfortunately, things didn't quite go to his plan, as at 10:40, the opposition party, the DP, called an emergency parliamentary meeting, and actually even the leader of the ruling party, Ha Dong-hun, also decided to attend and called some of his party members to attend with him. By 11 p.m, the martial law had officially taken effect, and just past 11, politicians were starting to arrive at the National Assembly. However, the entrance had already been blocked by police buses. Police buses are a common sight in Korea. They're typically present at any form of large social event, or particularly like political rallies or things like that. And in this case, the police buses were being used to block the entrance of the National Assembly to prevent the politicians from getting inside, which technically, according to the first rule of this martial law, is also illegal. There's not supposed to be any political gatherings. But considering the martial law itself is illegal, you could argue that they're still very much within their right to gather, because what they're doing is illegal, what he did is illegal. We're all breaking the law here, so... The other party who had gathered at the National Assembly at this time were the South Korean public themselves. At this point, there were already hundreds of people, and there are some really impressive images of them helping politicians to climb over the walls of the National Assembly compound so they can get past the police barricade and get into the National Assembly building to stop this madness. There was also the very funny stream of Lee Jae-myung, the leader of the DP party, and the next candidate-elect if they were to go to a presidential election, live streaming himself on his YouTube channel as he climbed over the wall. Lee Jae-myung does not have a positive image here in South Korea, and I think it says a lot of his character that he thought that this moment of like national crisis was like his best time for a publicity stunt. But alas, as a marketer, I can't hate it. Don't hate the player, hate the game. Anyway, on Wednesday, December 4th, at approximately just past midnight, approximately 150 plus lawmakers had finally made it inside Parliament, and they and their legal aides were using actual military tactics to barricade doors and windows from the inside of the National Assembly, because on the outside, the Korean military paratroopers were arriving on the scene. They arrived via helicopter, landing in and near the National Assembly compound, and this is where we saw some very scary footage, honestly, of the public and the military clashing. Fortunately, nobody was hurt in this situation, but it was very unsettling to see the soldiers breaking into the National Assembly building, which again is also illegal. The military should never be used to stop a democratic vote, and although you could say, well, the National Assembly meeting to vote in the first place is also illegal. As we already discussed, there's a lot of technicalities here because everything that's going on, it's very illegal. So at this point, it's fair game to anybody, I guess. But knowing that the military had arrived, this also urged the National Assembly to begin their vote with the members who were inside. At about 1 a.m., 190 of the present lawmakers made a unanimous vote to end the martial law. And again, by Korean constitution, once the National Assembly has voted to nullify martial law, the Korean president is obliged to listen. And this means that we're now waiting for the president's choice. Is he going to honor the constitution and follow the rules, which, mind you, based on his previous track record over the last few hours, he's already not doing? Or is he going to go full rogue, commit treason, and try to make South Korea a dictatorship? Arguably, calling martial law was also already doing that, but he could double down at this point. So the whole country waited with bated breath, but in the meantime, the Speaker of the House did urge the military to leave, as technically, until the president has either agreed or disagreed, martial law should have ended at that point. It is worth noting that although the military did pull back from the National Assembly building, because ultimately there's nothing for them to do at this point. The National Assembly members have already voted, so there's nothing for the soldiers to stop. The defense minister, who was also the acting commander of the military, said that he would follow the president's ruling if the president decided to continue with the martial law, disregarding the National Assembly's vote. So that was still a very scary state to be in for a lot of the country. But fortunately, at 4:26 a.m, the president did actually make an additional emergency announcement that he would be honouring the National Assembly's decision, and after just 6 hours, the martial law decree was lifted at 4:40 a.m. Hell of a night, but things are far from over. Later on the 4th, on Wednesday, the Democratic Party and all of the minor parties actually submitted a motion for the president to be impeached. Meanwhile, the president's own party, the ruling party, the PPP, expressed their dissatisfaction with the fact that the president had tried to implement martial law. However, they did say that they were staunchly against the notion to impeach the president, which is a little bit of a problem, and we'll come back to why that is a problem when we talk about what's happening currently, but it was very frustrating and disappointing for a lot of the Korean public. On Thursday, December 5th, further information came out about the military operations, and it was actually discovered that the reason that the military helicopters landed after midnight was actually because of miscommunication. As we mentioned, the police were on the scene pretty much immediately after the martial law declaration, which kind of gives the impression that they had been tipped off or notified that they would need to be present at the National Assembly soon. We don't know if they knew why, but to some degree, there was a level of preparation there. So many people had the question of why weren't the military there just as quickly? Why did they arrive almost an hour and a half later? And it turns out the reason was the ground troops had been notified that they were going to be summoned to the National Assembly, but the actual Air Force, who controls Korea's airspace, hadn't been notified that helicopters would need to fly at that time. So that caused a little bit of a delay. And this delay is actually significant because we have to think what would have happened if the soldiers had arrived on time, if they had arrived shortly after 10:30 when they were supposed to be there, and they had successfully blocked the parliament members from getting inside and blocked the National Assembly from being able to make their vote. And this is actually something that we could very much see from history. Whenever there were martial law declarations in the past, one of the first moves of whoever declared that martial law would be to arrest all political opponents. And it was actually revealed on the 6th that President Yoon had planned to do the same. The Korean Herald reports, Hong Jang-won, the first deputy director of the National Intelligence Service, told the National Assembly that he had been ordered to take into custody several prominent political figures. And he actually revealed 11 of those names, which I will put on the screen, which include people not only from the DP party, but also from the PPP party, including the leader, Han Dong-hun, which actually was an interesting update because it made the PPP change their tune slightly. Remember that originally they said that while they condemned the martial law, they didn't support the impeachment of the president. However, after finding out that they were supposed to be kidnapped and possibly killed, which is a very real possibility based on things that have happened through history, Han Dong-hun did actually change his tune and say that they wanted to suspend the president. They didn't use the word impeach, but they said suspend the president from his duties. And actually later on Friday, the president actually had a one-to-one meeting with Han, and they met for, I believe, around 2 hours. But following the meeting, Han said that ultimately his mind had not been changed, and he was sticking to his prior statement. At the same time of all of this, there was also a much more concerning situation taking place, a fear of a second martial law implementation, and possibly this one being far more organised than the first. There was a military helicopter flying continuously above the National Assembly building from the morning of Friday, and there were leaks saying that military soldiers had been told to stand by at their bases and their phones had been confiscated, and it was likely that they were waiting for commands to perform a secondary coup, possibly with much more force. Of course, the Korean people were not having this, and this led to people actually parking their cars on the lawn of the National Assembly and surrounding area so that there would be no places for helicopters to land, and a couple of assembly members actually sleeping inside the National Assembly overnight until Saturday, so that they would be prepared in the case of any military action. The reason Saturday is important, Saturday being today mind you, is because today at 3 p.m. there will be a significant rally, a public protest of around 200 to 400,000 people for the impeachment of the president, and the National Assembly is set to vote. What's more, this morning the president did actually issue a public address, a public apology if you will, and just like many YouTube apologies, it was, let's say, less than satisfactory, but let's read it verbatim. Dear fellow citizens, I declared martial law at 11 p.m. on December 3rd. About 2 hours later, around 1 a.m. on December 4th, in accordance with the National Assembly's resolution to nullify martial law declaration, I ordered the military forces to withdraw and lifted martial law after a late night cabinet meeting. The declaration of emergency martial law was motivated by the desperation of the president, who is the final decision maker in state affairs. However, in the process, I caused concerns and inconvenience to the people. I'm very sorry and apologise to the people who must have been very surprised. Regarding my declaration, I will confront my legal and political responsibility. Dear fellow citizens, there are rumours that martial law will be imposed again, but let me be clear, there will be no such thing as a second martial law declaration. Dear fellow citizens, for the rest of my term, I entrust my power to our party to stabilise the political situation. Our party and the government will together take responsibility for future state affairs. Once again, I apologise for causing concern to the people. Again, not the best apology. And honestly, most Korean people don't care. Like, quite generally, nobody is saying that this is an excuse or that this rectifies the situation to any degree. However, the PPP have changed their tune again, and they're now saying that they are once again firmly against the impeachment of the president. So we'll have to see how they vote. And before we get into the significance of the PPP stance on the vote outcome, let's actually talk about some of the reactions of the Korean people themselves. As I've alluded to previously, martial law has a deep history in Korea, and for a lot of people it was very scary to think that their country had been to hell and back in the time that they were sleeping, and for others it was a call to action for them to go and fight for their democracy. Many of you might not know this, but South Korea was actually also a dictatorship in its early days following the Korean War. In 1979, the current president was Park Chung-hee. You guys may have heard of him, as he is often accredited as being the one who boosted Korea's reputation by implementing economic policies that gave us brands like Samsung, LG, Kia, Hyundai, and more that are still going strong to this day. And he's often regarded as one of the most influential presidents in Korean history, but he was a dictator. In 1979, he was assassinated by Chun Doo-han, who at the time was a high-up general in the military. In May 1980, Chun Doo-han performed another coup where he implemented martial law on the country of South Korea, and he ruled over the country as a dictator. As part of his martial law legislation, he introduced concentration camps to South Korea, also known as re-education camps. If you watch Train to Busan, they mention re-education in that movie. And this is essentially where any political opposition was taken, and that's not just politicians, even regular civilians who stood up against the government, if you will call them that, were taken to these re-education camps and beaten, tortured, and sometimes even killed. One of the most significant events that took place during this time was also the Gwangju democratization movement, also known more morbidly as the Gwangju Massacre, which took place on the 18th of May 1980. This was where university students from a university in Gwangju held a public protest, and they were met with full military force. Hundreds of people died, and it was a brutal example to the Korean people what could happen if you tried to stand up against the government. And I think the ferocity of the Korean people's response can be explained through the fact that this was just 40 years ago. Like, so many people alive today, people the age of my parents or older, would have lived through that and would remember those images, would remember the bloodshed and the absolute fear that they lived under during that time. I've met many people who've told me that they weren't able to sleep that night, even following Yoon's declaration, because they were still worried about what could happen next. During Chon Doo-hwan's time, there was also the June uprising that took place in 1987. This was a huge public protest with 4 to 5 million attendees. And this was once again the people demanding democracy be brought to South Korea. People wanted to be able to vote for who was in power. They wanted to have control of, have a say in their government. And I think seeing these many people gather following the violent acts that he'd already done was enough to convince Chon Doo-hwan that he couldn't suppress the South Korean people forever. And he conceded. He agreed to hold a election the following year in 1988, which is the point at which Korea became a democracy and has been one ever since. So you can see that to Koreans, their democracy is something they've historically had to fight for, and it's something that they would give their lives to protect. There was a very cool example of this. Like, honestly, this woman is the baddest bitch I've ever seen, for lack of a better word. There was a video of An Gui-ryong, a news announcer turned politician, facing off with a soldier. She not only was fighting with the soldier, but she did not back down even when the muzzle of his weapon was pointed at her. And I think this shows how much the Korean people are willing to sacrifice for the sake of what's right. I also have an exclusive quote from attendee of the midnight rally that I would like to read to you guys now. I attended the protest at the National Assembly for about 4 hours after the declaration of martial law, but I did not clash directly with the military. I went because the Korean people absolutely cannot tolerate the implementation of martial law. Our parents and grandparents gave their blood to stop martial law in the past, so I wasn't scared. The rights of our people are more important than soldiers and guns. We fight amongst ourselves internally all the time, but in crisis, we work together. I think this statement alone perfectly summarizes the minds of most of the Korean public and the people that I've spoken to. I would also like to say that as a foreigner living in Korea, although I think our experience is of less importance, I do want to say that it is quite scary. For myself personally, because I know the history of Korea and because I know how hard the Korean people have fought for democracy, I honestly was not that concerned once I knew that this wasn't a war announcement, because I knew that the Korean people will absolutely squash this. I genuinely believe there isn't a president in history that could beat the South Korean nation, but I honestly expected that martial law would last for around a week or two before it was squashed. I was quite impressed by how quickly everything was resolved, but I was concerned about the casualties that might take place in the process, and I'm very relieved to see that nobody was hurt and not a single bullet was fired, because all it took was one person being a little bit trigger happy or being a little anxious or whatever you might say, and things could have devolved very quickly and turned very violent. But unfortunately that didn't happen. Talking to friends and other acquaintances, of course people were terrified, because another thing is, when these big things happen, it's very rare for any country to prioritize translation. And I speak Korean, but military terminology is a brand new ball game for me. So even when this happened, I was struggling. Like, I spent a good 10-20 minutes trying to find information of what the rules of martial law were and why the martial law was being implemented. It was actually my mum who contacted me. I was watching YouTube and eating dinner, and she messaged me. She was like, "What's all this about martial law going on in Korea?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And my initial assumption was, oh my god, what has Kim Jong-un done? Like, North Korea's attacking us. Ultimately, I don't think that's half as significant as the things that obviously would have been going through the minds of Korean people. But yeah, it was still pretty scary for all of us. Now that we have an understanding of what happened and people's reaction to it, I know a lot of you guys are probably asking the question like, why the hell did this happen? But before we get to that, I just want to finish the timeline by talking about what's going to be happening today, because I think that's probably one of the most significant parts of this story. But before that, if you have found this video informative or you think it's provided some value, I would really appreciate it if you could like this video. And if you like this kind of social commentary or more lighthearted things like K-pop commentary or just snippets of life in Korea through vlogs and other content like that, then maybe you can consider subscribing as well. The big question now is what's going to happen next, and the short answer is there is going to be a vote for impeachment, and that is happening today, Saturday, December 7th, here in South Korea, in actually just a few hours. But I want to talk about the likelihood of the impeachment actually happening and what the process would be. One thing that's important to note is that Yoon has already had a piss poor approval rate prior to all of this happening. Since the impeachment of his predecessor, Park Geun-hye, the last president from the PPP, the nation voted for the Democratic Party elect at the time, who was Moon Jae-in, but many people were dissatisfied with his performance as the economy shrunk during his term, which honestly, I don't like Moon Jae-in as well for various reasons, but I do think he had a bit of a hard time because he was the president during COVID. But following Moon Jae-in's piss poor performance, people voted for Yoon Suk-yeol back from the PPP. However, Yoon Suk-yeol actually has had a worse economic performance than Moon Jae-in. So despite the flip-flop between parties, things have continued to get worse, and that has really disappointed a lot of people as they had high expectations for the Conservative Party to restore the economy. And there had already been previous protests for him to be impeached for 1 or 2 months prior to this martial law decree, but this was definitely the final nail in the coffin for the majority of the public. And as I've mentioned already, there is scheduled to be a mass protest in Gwanghwamun at 3 p.m. today, and they did actually say that they were going to do the official vote at 7 p.m, but they've now pulled it forward to 5 p.m. So at 5 p.m, the National Assembly members will vote on the motion to impeach the president. The important thing to note here is that the National Assembly of South Korea is made up of 300 members, and for the impeachment motion to be approved, 2/3, i.e. 200 out of 300 members of the National Assembly have to vote in favour of the impeachment. The problem is that only 192 seats are held by the opposition and other minority parties, whereas 108 seats are held by the PPP. So at least 8 people from Yoon's side would have to turn against him to actually move forward the impeachment motion. However, as we've already discussed, the PPP keep flip-flopping on what their opinion is. Will they be voting for him or against him is something we can't know. And technically we are only hearing the opinion of the party head, Han Dong-hun, but there is a chance that some of his party members will simply go against what he tells them and vote any which way they please. So it's hard to say this is a slam dunk situation because unfortunately the PPP, the ruling party, do still have a big influence on the final outcome. But in the case of Park Geun-hye, at least half of her party members did actually vote for her impeachment also. So there is still very much a chance that some PPP members will vote in favour of the impeachment. Following the vote, if the 2/3 majority is met, the president will be immediately stripped of his duties as president and will be put under suspension. However, the case will still have to go to the Supreme Court, or aka the Constitutional Court, for a final decision. In the meantime, the Prime Minister will become the acting president. Once the Supreme Court begin reviewing the case, out of the 9 justices, they also need a 2/3 majority, so 6 of the justices, to vote in favour of upholding the impeachment motion. And this is a bit sticky right now in Korea because actually 3 spaces of the Supreme Court are empty. So there are quite literally just the 6. However, if they all vote unanimously, they can still move forward with the impeachment. In the case that they actually do approve the impeachment, then the Korean constitution states that within 60 days, a new president has to be elected and inaugurated. In the case of Park Geun-hye, the last president who was impeached, it took around 4 months for the Supreme Court to make a decision, and then Moon Jae-in was inaugurated on the 59th day following that decree. However, personally, I do think this situation is a little bit more cut and dry than Park Geun-hye's situation, so I can imagine that a resolution will be reached much sooner, and it's very likely that the vote will take place, the election for the new president will take place in early February. I say that because January has the Lunar New Year, which is like one of the two major holidays here in South Korea, and people generally don't want to talk about politics on big family occasions. A la Thanksgiving in America, it usually doesn't end well. So I imagine that the government would try to set it in a way that it can take place after Lunar New Year, but we will have a new president by the spring. However, we do have to consider both sides. What happens if the 2/3 majority is not reached in the National Assembly or the Supreme Court? And the simple answer is that the opposition party will move to have the president tried for treason. The reality is there is a huge difference between the motivations of the Democratic Party and the People's Power Party. In the case of the People's Power Party, this will be their second consecutive president to be impeached. So they actually do have reason to vote against the impeachment because it looks terrible for their party, and the reality is it could be enough to break their party. It could completely break the trust of their party. On the flip side, the Democratic Party want this election to happen as soon as possible because right now they have the country's favour. People have lost faith in the PPP, so this is the best way for the DP to guarantee a win. Their presidential candidate, Lee Jae-myung, actually lost against Yoon in the previous presidential election. However, despite him being an unpopular choice, right now he is the people's choice, I guess, because he's the leader of the opposition party. So they can basically guarantee a slam dunk victory. Even in the case of Park Geun-hye, just like in America where there are red states and there are blue states, within Korea there are also red cities and blue cities. And I have another quote here from a Korean person explaining how even the traditionally conservative states can change their votes in the case of disappointment with their party. In the case of Park Geun-hye, the typically conservative Gyeongsang-do region all voted for the DP, with the exception of Daegu. Although the public were generally not satisfied with the economic performance of Moon Jae-in, the economy has slowed down even more during the presidency of Yoon Suk-yeol. Because the Democratic Party know that they basically have a slam dunk victory, they are going to go very aggressively to have the president tried for treason. By South Korean law, under South Korean law, the president is pretty much immune to any illegal activity, but the only exception is causing insurrection. Considering this would be a slam dunk victory for the Democratic Party, it's so clear why the DP are pushing so hard for this. The Supreme Prosecutor's Office also have revealed plans to establish a special investigation headquarters to investigate President Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law declaration case. So the government are also moving to try him for treason, regardless of whether he's impeached or not. No matter how you look at it, the chances of Yoon Suk-yeol completing his term are incredibly small. It's not a matter of if he will be prosecuted, it's really the circumstances under when and how that are still unclear. There is also one other potential outcome, but based on the fact that he gave a national address this morning, I doubt this is going to be the case, and that is that he could choose to resign. But I don't think he's going to do that because all it's going to do is speed up the timeline of him going to jail. And also there's the reason behind why he did all of this in the first place, which is his wife. Yeah, his wife. Okay, so getting into the biggest question I'm sure you guys had, why did this all happen and what do you mean it's his wife? I'm not going to go into the exact details of his wife's scandals, but what I will tell you is that the First Lady of South Korea has never been liked. Her approval rating is far lower than her husband's, and she has been caught up in continuous scandals ever since the beginning of his term. There are accusations of bribery, accusation of political tampering, accusations of embezzlement and insider trading, and so many other things. I will link a article with a list and explanation of all her scandals down below. But the wife of Yoon Suk-yeol, the First Lady, has been a constant thorn in the side of this administration. And despite this, Yoon Suk-yeol is a notorious wife guy. He's known for loving his wife dearly. They don't have any children, so it is just the two of them. And she did stand by him through turbulent times in his early career, as he took a very long time to pass the bar and become a prosecutor, which is what his job was before he became the president. What we do know for sure is that this was premeditated. As we said, we know that the police were on standby and that the military, some units, had been notified ahead of time. And that's not the only evidence that we have to prove that either. Actually, it turns out that the defense minister, Kim Yong-hyun, is high school friends with the president. So they've had a very close relationship. And the defense minister actually came out the morning of December 4th to say that he was the one who had encouraged the president to implement the martial law. And he resigned from his position voluntarily, and the president accepted his resignation. Of course, people believe that's a lot of scapegoating and that he absolutely was one of the co-conspirators, but he was not the mastermind behind the plan. And he's actually been barred from leaving the country. He's been marked as a flight risk because they think that the reason he resigned so quickly is that he's going to try and escape, which could have also been one of Yoon's own plans should he have been successful in implementing martial law. For this to have been as premeditated as it was, there has to be a clear motivation. And I do want to just put a little bit of a disclaimer here and say that from this point onwards, this is in the area of conspiracy. But this is a conspiracy that is believed by the majority of Korean people, because corruption within the government is not a new world concept, is it? So basically, because of all the scandals that Yoon's wife has had, and because the fact that she is his wife, people believe that the walls were starting to close in around her. Yoon was isolated politically because the DP held most of the seats within the National Assembly, so he couldn't pass any bills that he wanted, and any motions he would have possibly used to pardon his wife would also have been shut down. At the same time, he is going to be isolated personally because with the legal system starting to crack down on his wife, there was a very high chance she was going to be thrown in jail, and that would leave him by himself. And there's also a chance that he would be thrown in jail as a co-conspirator after he finished his term as president. At the same time, the DP presidential candidate, Lee Jae-myung, also has his own string of legal cases that are in the works right now. Part of the reason he lost the election 2 years ago in the first place is because of rumours that he is part of the mob, that he's a gangster, or that he uses underhanded methods to get things done. And he's very much a Trump, basically, even though he's technically the Democratic Party. So he also has some court cases which should be catching up to him very soon, and if found guilty, he would lose his ability to run for president in the next election. So people are speculating that Yoon and Lee made a deal. If Yoon does something dramatic that would get him impeached as soon as possible, that would speed up the election timeline, and then Lee would be guaranteed a win, as we've already discussed. The DP would be guaranteed to win the next election. And if he becomes president before he goes to court for any of his legal cases, he basically gets to evade them because all his crimes would be forgiven. He can pardon himself, and as part of that deal, he can pardon Yoon and his wife and stop either of them from going to jail. South Korea has a very long history of presidents going to jail as soon as their presidential term is over, and then being forgiven by subsequent presidents. And this, as crazy as it might sound to foreign ears, is a very real possibility within Korean society and history and politics. So again, it's a very crazy conspiracy, but it's the only logical thing that people can find because there is no other good reason. There is no other motivation for this sort of action. And as we've seen, it was a very small likelihood that this would have worked in Yoon's favour. As I already said, even as a foreigner, even as someone who's only studied Korean history, I felt like the longest this martial law decree could last was 2 weeks before the Korean people absolutely overthrow the government, essentially. So it's a hell of a conspiracy, and honestly, it's something that we can never know for sure. But I think if we watch the way that things play out today and play out in the next few months, we can get an idea of if we were on the right case. Because if he does get impeached and then he does win and then Yoon is pardoned, it matches, you know what I mean? Unfortunately, that's not a question that we can answer today, but what we can say for sure is that I think the Korean people have set a great example for all of us, not only as a warning to the Korean government, but to governments around the world, that the people can fight back. We live in quite turbulent political times, and I think sometimes we feel overwhelming sense of powerlessness, but I think Korea showed us that there is strength in numbers. Anyway, today's topic was a little bit heavier than my usual, and I'm still fairly new to this commentary stuff, but I hope that you found this video enjoyable and helpful, and if you did, I hope you would consider subscribing for more Korea cultural content and vlogs, as well as commentary on more light-hearted Korean cultural topics like the ongoing battle between Min Hee-jin, New Jeans and Hype, which is my favourite thing to talk about these days. Otherwise, this has been Han from the Haniverse. Thank you so much for stopping by.